In 1976, engineers made a promise. Build one dam, tame one river, save 1 million lives from flooding. It worked. For a while, the water stopped rising. The villages stopped drowning. People called it a miracle of modern engineering. But underneath that calm reservoir, something else was happening. Something nobody had planned for. Something nobody understood until it was too late. Because when you stop a river, you don't just stop water. You stop everything that river was carrying. The silt, the nutrients, the balance of an entire ecosystem built over thousands of years. And when that balance breaks, it doesn't break quietly. Farmlands hundreds of miles away started dying. A coastline began vanishing into the sea. Fishermen watched their catch disappear overnight. And scientists started asking a terrifying question. Did the dam that saved them from one disaster quietly create another? This is the story of a flood control project that worked exactly as designed and still changed a nation forever. The dam sat on the Nile, just north of Aswan. Finished in 1970 after 11 years of construction. A wall of concrete and rock, stretching over 3 kilometers wide. Behind it, a new lake formed, one of the largest man-made lakes on Earth. Egyptian officials called it the end of an ancient curse. For thousands of years, the Nile flooded every summer, sometimes gently, sometimes with enough force to wipe out entire villages. Now, the floods were gone. Farmers no longer feared the rainy season. Engineers were treated like national heroes. But 3 years later, something strange showed up in the fields. The soil wasn't producing like before. Crops that once thrived without effort now needed chemical fertilizer just to survive. Farmers assumed it was bad seed or bad luck. Nobody suspected the dam. Then reports started coming in from the coast, hundreds of kilometers away. Fishermen near the Mediterranean noticed their nets coming back empty. Sardine catches, once abundant, dropped by more than half within a few short years. At first, officials dismissed it as normal ocean fluctuation. But an old fisherman named Hassan Marzouk had a different theory. He'd worked those waters for over 30 years. And he said something that made everyone uncomfortable. He said the sea was hungry now because something it used to feed on had stopped arriving completely. Hassan's words spread through the fishing villages fast. But it took a scientist to explain what he already felt in his bones. Dr. Fathi al-Rashid, a young geologist working with Egypt's Ministry of Irrigation, started digging through old survey data. What he found made him sit back in his chair. For centuries, the Nile's floods carried something crucial downstream. Silt, rich, dark sediment packed with nutrients. It fertilized farmland naturally, and when it reached the sea, it fed the entire coastal ecosystem. Now that silt was trapped, sitting at the bottom of the new reservoir, growing thicker every year. None of it was reaching the farms. None of it was reaching the ocean. Al-Rashid brought his findings to a senior irrigation official named Mahmoud Fawzi. Fawzi read the report twice. Then he asked a question that chilled the room. If the silt keeps collecting behind the dam, how long until it becomes a problem for the dam itself? Nobody had an answer. Meanwhile, along the coast, the erosion was accelerating. Without fresh sediment replenishing the shoreline, the Mediterranean began eating away at the Nile Delta. Entire chunks of farmland near Rosetta were disappearing into the sea, sometimes several meters a year. Local farmers watched land their grandfathers had worked simply vanish overnight. One farmer named Ibrahim Sultan stood at the edge of his flooded field and said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. He said the river used to give them life. Now it was quietly taking their land back, piece by piece. And what they discovered next would prove this was only the beginning. The erosion was only the beginning, because something else was happening deep in the irrigation canals that fed the farmland. Without the annual floods, the water in those canals stopped moving the way it used to. It sat still for longer periods. And still water, in a hot climate, invites something dangerous. Health workers in villages along the Nile started noticing a pattern. More farmers coming in with fatigue, stomach pain, swollen bellies. a disease called schistosomiasis, spread by parasites living in freshwater snails. Before the dam, the seasonal floods used to flush the canals and disrupt the snail population. Now, with calm permanent water, the snails were thriving. A physician named Dr. Adel Karim, working in a rural clinic near Minya, saw infection rates climb sharply within a decade. He raised the alarm to regional health authorities. At first, they brushed it off. Then the numbers kept rising. In some farming communities, infection rates reportedly reached over 40% of the population. Karim later said something that stuck with his colleagues for years. He said they had traded one disaster for another, just slower, quieter, and harder to see coming. But the irrigation engineers had a bigger problem forming underground, because the water table beneath the fields was rising in ways nobody expected. And in certain villages, farmers began noticing something strange happening to their own homes. Cracks, crumbling walls, foundations sinking as if the ground itself no longer wanted to hold them up. Nobody yet understood why. But whatever was happening beneath their feet was about to reach the ancient temples that had survived for over 3,000 years. The rising water table wasn't just cracking houses. It was creeping towards some of the oldest monuments on Earth. Temples that had survived floods, wars, empires, and thousands of years of desert heat. Now facing a threat no pharaoh could have imagined. Salt. As groundwater levels rose, it pulled salt up through the limestone and sandstone foundations of ancient structures. At Karnak Temple, conservationists began noticing something alarming. Carvings that had remained sharp for millennia were slowly flaking apart. An archaeologist named Youssef Hamdi, working with the Egyptian Antiquities Organization, documented the damage year by year. He said the stone was rotting from the inside out. Salt crystals were forming beneath the surface, then expanding, then shattering the rock like slow-motion explosions. Something no war, no invader, no desert storm had managed to do in 3,000 years was now happening quietly because of clean water sitting where it shouldn't. Hamdi pushed for immediate government intervention. Officials were caught in an impossible position. The same dam that saved millions from flooding, feeding electricity to homes across the nation, was now threatening the very heritage that defined Egypt's identity. International experts were called in. UNESCO teams flew to Luxor to assess the damage. Some predicted certain monuments could lose significant structural integrity within just a few decades if nothing changed. Meanwhile, back near the dam itself, engineers were tracking a separate number: the buildup of silt at the reservoir floor. It was rising faster than anyone had calculated in 1970, and one engineer, reviewing the projections quietly one night, realized something that made him pick up the phone immediately. At the current rate, the reservoir had a lifespan, and that clock had already started ticking. The engineer's name was Samir Okasha, and what he calculated kept him awake that night. At current sedimentation rates, the reservoir's storage capacity would shrink significantly within a century. Not an immediate collapse, but a slow, mathematical certainty, written in tons of silt piling up every single year. He brought his findings to senior officials the next morning. The response was measured, careful, unwilling to alarm the public. Because by then, the dam wasn't just infrastructure. It was the backbone of the entire nation. It generated over 10% of Egypt's electricity. It protected millions of families from the floods that once devastated their ancestors. Officials weren't about to call a mistake. Instead, they adapted. New fertilizer programs replaced the lost silt on farmland. Coastal barriers were built to slow the erosion near Rosetta and Damietta. Health campaigns targeted the snail populations, spreading disease through the canals. Conservation teams developed new methods to protect Karnak and Luxor from the rising salt. Each fix, patching a problem the dam itself had created. Decades later, the numbers tell a complicated story. The floods never returned. Millions of lives were saved from the disasters that once defined the Nile's history. But the coastline kept shrinking. The temples kept fighting a slow decay. And the reservoir kept collecting silt one grain at a time, exactly as Samir predicted. The dam did exactly what it was built to do. Nobody lied. Nobody miscalculated the flood risk. They simply never imagined that solving one disaster could quietly set another into motion, one that would take generations to fully understand. If stories like this make you think twice about the world around you, stay close. There's more history hiding in plain sight.